Ninth chapter of Mark, verses 2 through 9. It's one of those weird texts that sort of comes up in the middle of things. And it doesn't really matter 6 days after what, for what it's worth. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, clearly, for they were all, he was in particular, terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Cheers. It always seems like whenever I bump into a friend or an acquaintance and I say, "Hey, how you been?" The answer has shifted. It's no longer some variant of, "Oh, fine, thanks." That old polite kind of brush aside, everything's fine, we don't talk about things in public sort of thing. Um, Now it seems like so often what I hear in that "how you doing" is, "Oh, I'm just so busy." I'm not gonna ask how many of you are like, "Uh-huh," because we don't need to out ourselves quite that badly here. The thing that interests me about that particular response is not is that it doesn't necessarily carry any sort of tone of despair or fatigue. It doesn't sound like the reaction to busyness that I tend to feel that one might expect. It always sounds vaguely proud, satisfied. "Oh, things are so busy." It's really weird. And yet it makes sense in this lovely capitalist society in which we live. There is a moral value that we appear to have added in recent years to busyness. Action has become somehow virtuous in and of itself. If you are not busy, then you must be a terrible, terrible human. Busyness means that we are important, perhaps indispensable. Busyness means that we are not, in modern political parlance, which, I usually don't do, but, I can quote them, idle moochers living off the busyness and the goodness of others. But what does it mean when busyness is goodness? Do we still believe with our grandmothers that idle hands are the devil's workshop? Mine didn't often say that, but you know what I mean. Our Protestant work ethic, that lovely American capitalist value, has come so far that we would condemn those who are not busy to the point of exhaustion, out of their inability to say no. Indeed, we have become skeptical of those who rest or who cannot maintain a grueling pace. We have become skeptical even of ourselves when it turns out that we need rest, and we question whether our body's physical needs should really be our priority. Because the virtue of busyness skews our priorities, to the point where we strive so hard simply to keep busy that when the time does arrive for us to slow down, to be still, to rest, we fidget. We wonder what is wrong as we struggle against the discomfort of stillness and silence. We use busyness to fill the holes that we should perhaps best pay attention to. Technology has not brought this moral value into being, but it has solidified it as we are presented with a means of keeping busy that can easily be carried in pocket or purse. We need never be alone. Our work, our social communities, even vast libraries of books are available at our fingertips 24/7. But what happens when busyness is virtuous in and of itself? and separate from the possible virtue of the actual actions accomplished. Does all of our productivity have any meaning at that point? The tasks that we assign ourselves simply to stay in motion become burdensome. Filled as we are with actions and goals and appearances and anxiety, we sometimes end up feeling hollow. And so we find other chores, other actions that ensure that we continue to be busy just for the sake of being busy, of keeping our hands occupied, busy enough to not wonder what would happen if we actually had to sit with ourselves, busy enough to not wonder why we don't feel fulfilled and fed and nurtured. What has that to do with the transfiguration, Eliza? You ask me. Good question, y'all. I started reflecting on busyness when I wondered, I sort of read the context around this whole section, and I began to wonder to myself if all of that busyness wasn't very much how Peter felt in that moment. There had to have been such a lot to do as a disciple, beyond just having to keep up theologically, because you never really knew when Jesus was going to throw a pop quiz your way. And you had to be ready to understand parables and ask wise questions that showed you that you were worthy of discipleship after all, or something like that. There were also all of the human resources questions that come up when a prophet, 12 disciples, their families, and a bunch of hangers on are tramping all around the Galilean and Judean countryside for 3 or so years. There are details to arrange. Where is everyone going to sleep? What is everyone going to eat? It's all well and good to feed 4,000 on a hillside, as they had done a couple stories back from this one, but that doesn't really help in the day-to-day of several dozen people. And with that many traveling together for so long, there are always disputes to be settled at some point during the day. The difference between adults and toddlers, after all, is usually size and vocabulary, more than emotional regulation. And poor Peter, trying his hardest, finds that every time he turns around, there went Jesus, off by himself again. You gotta figure the man was driven to distraction. And so I found myself wondering, as I read through the text, what lists, what details were going through Peter's head that day, as the small group headed off for a hike up a mountain. What problems was he earnestly trying to discuss with Jesus? Finally getting Jesus nearly to himself, was he talking as fast as the strenuous hike permitted when the moment of dazzling brilliance broke in? It's a hard thing to disengage from all of the doing that keeps us busy and to just be. Several years ago, I was out running errands when I looked up to see one of the most gorgeous sunsets I had ever witnessed. It was one of those bring you to a full stop in a parking lot kind of sunsets. I know this because it brought me to a full stop in a parking lot. It was very nearly a bring you to your knees in the parking lot sort of sunset, but I didn't want to get hit by a car. I remember staring at it for a long moment, the kind that just paints the entire sky in so many colors. But instead of just standing and bearing witness and letting it sink all the way into my soul, I did what I think a lot of us would do. I reached into my pocket, I grabbed my cell phone, and I clicked the camera open. Instead of just stopping, watching this amazing sunset, I fiddled with the white balance and the lighting settings, and finally clicked a really, really bad picture at the very end of the sunset that I deleted almost immediately as being worthless. In an attempt to capture the moment, I had missed it all. I think Peter can relate. And it reminds me that even when we know better, it's hard to stop. Caught up in details in life, filled as we are with worry and busyness, things we're running towards or things we're running from, we leave no room for light, or sunsets, or fiery mountaintops, or dazzling radiance. We fill our lives so full of busyness and details that there are no spaces left. no cracks where God might enter and break us open. When light does appear in our lives, when God's presence is so palpably obvious that we are stopped in our tracks, we take those moments and we try to hold on to them. We try to capture them in cameras or in tents, in dwellings, rather than simply experiencing them. We prioritize motion over being, the human virtue of busyness over the experience of God's abundance. When we are at a place where the dazzling radiance gets pushed aside, God's daily presence in our mundane lives gets totally unnoticed. What does it take to experience transcendence? To go up on that mountaintop, to bear witness to the presence of God and of the ancestors before us, and not be Peter. What does it take to sit with the glory of the world and just experience it? I think a lot of us would suggest that solitude is required, and certainly Jesus was known for his solitary tendencies. But today we find an experience that is hardly solitary. Not only does Jesus take some disciples with him, but he is joined in the mountaintop time by those who have gone before. While Jesus' comfort with solitude might have helped him to stop and simply be and experience the divine presence, this is also a moment in which we are all called to let go, to let a trusted friend, a colleague, a beloved run things for a little bit, to stop worrying like Peter about the details or the protocol or the right theology, to stop worrying, perhaps, about what other people will think, to set aside the things with which we fill ourselves so that God can fill us, even if that means we'll have to break old rhythms or change our priorities and our values, even if it means that we'll need to empty ourselves so that we may be filled anew. And it makes me wonder if these aren't indeed the very moments we need to set aside the priorities of this world, the tendency to busyness, capturing and holding on to moments, whether in tents or in photographs. These are the moments that remind us that the world as we know it is not the world that God dreams for us. And the moments of presence lead us into a world in which we spend less time with status and pace and external validation. And we find in the mountaintop moments, the ones that we experience in our own day-to-day lives, the reset that shifts our daily priorities away from exhaustion and into a space of presence for all of creation. There is a reason that the lectionary exists, this cycle of readings that churches read throughout the year, throughout a 3-year cycle. We're in the part of the cycle that reads through the Gospel of Mark right now. There is a reason for this cycle of readings, and it is not just to make lazy pastors like myself preach the hard texts as well as the easy ones, although that is a benefit. But more than that, there is a reason that the lectionary, that cycle of readings, puts this particular text, Transfiguration, on the Sunday before Lent begins every single year. This is one of the readings, this is one of the lessons that reminds us of the power of God to break in and transform us, as well as the ease with which we, like Peter, set aside transformative presence in the quest for action or importance or appearances, or even just simply out of habit. These are values, these are habits that we have a few weeks to try and shake, starting on Wednesday, before we have the chance to be made new once again. These are the human values and the old habits that we must shed so that we can stand at the end of this coming season before the possibility of new life and in the light of a new day. We have a few weeks to reset ourselves from all that is crowding God out, to become aware of all that fills us without nourishing us, things that fill our time, our hearts, that bring us momentary comfort or fleeting pleasure, but which leave us feeling hollow. Things that speed us up so that we are unable to stop and simply be present with God. Or as hard as it can be in the busyness of life, to accept and acknowledge. We are coming into the season in which we remember that new life is possible, even here and even now. If we can let go of the details, the busyness, and trust in God's abundance. If we can deprioritize constant motion to be still enough, aware enough to see the dazzling glory of God in light and the beauty of this creation. If we can stop entirely when God shines brightly enough to stop us in our tracks. If we can stop, even in the midst of our routines, to see the presence that is always with us, even in muted, wintry morning light, even in familiar surroundings, even in the presence of all that we know on a day-to-day basis. This new life is possible, even in the midst of busyness. New life is possible wherever God is present, and it is up to us to make room. Thanks be to God. Hallelujah. Amen.